the observation that patients with severe personality disorders of different types had certain common features that were there in all cases, even if they had different constellation of pathological character traits. So patients with paranoid personality, narcissistic personality, borderline personality in a descriptive sense, antisocial personality, schizoid personality, etc., all had common features that seem to me central in the pathology of them related to the severity of it, and that could be diagnosed in initial interviews so that it was relatively easy to diagnose whether a person had a non-severe or a severe type of personality disorder. And these features were the organization or lack of organization of their concept of the self, whether they had an integrated view of self or dissociated, split off, contradictory elements of their self-experience. And second, the extent to which they had the capacity for an integrated view of significant others, or to the contrary, were totally dependent on the immediate behavior of other people to evaluate them without being able to assess what was permanent and continuous. So there was a lack of permanence and integration and continuity in the concept of self and the concept of significant others. And that seemed to me the essence of the pathology, using a term originally coined by Erickson, I called identity diffusion, in contrast to normal identity consisting in an integrated view of self and an integrated view of significant others. In addition, all these patients were clearly different from psychotic patients. They maintained the capacity of reality testing, meaning the capacity to differentiate self from non-self, intrapsychic from external stimuli, and maintain empathy with ordinary social criteria of reality. And finally, all these patients used primitive defensive operations centering upon the mechanism of splitting or primitive dissociation, denial, projective identification, omnipotence, omnipotent control, devaluation, and very centrally splitting itself. This in contrast to patients with normal identity who showed a clear predominance of mechanisms centering around repression, intellectualization, rationalization, negation, a healthier form of projection and idealization, reaction formations. So I raised the question in my mind, how could one explain these differences? What did they reflect in terms of normal or abnormal psychological development? And I applied psychoanalytic object relations theory to explain these developments. Let me say that this is now 40 years back and crystallized in a general theory of personality disorders about 30 years back, and we have been researching them for the last 30 years. While very often official classification systems paid very little attention to it, only now with the DSM-5 system they have finally realized that the essence of personality disorders is a disorder of the self and a disorder of the relation with significant others. That, in my view, derives from that lack of capacity for a realistic assessment of others, the predominance of these primitive defensive mechanisms, and of a psychopathology centered around conflicts about aggression, which is related to the subject of this conference.